Formula One is collapsing into chaos right in front of us. Drivers are now openly accusing the FIA of creating rules that are dangerous, impossible to control, and completely against real racing. And after Miami, new evidence may have just exposed something even worse. Because one penalty changed everything. Charles Leclerc lost positions hours after the race ended. Max Verstappen exploded against the regulations again. Multiple world champions are now attacking the FIA publicly. And behind closed doors, drivers reportedly signed a joint demand for immediate changes after a terrifying crash at over 300 km/h. But here is the part nobody can ignore anymore. The FIA already changed 7 major rules after only 4 races of the season. 7. That almost never happens in Formula One. And according to teams inside the paddock, those emergency fixes may have solved only 20% of the real problem. Now drivers believe they are being punished for mistakes the cars themselves are creating. And the deeper you go into the Miami controversy, the more it feels like Formula One is heading toward a full-scale war between the drivers and the FIA. If you enjoy Formula One stories that reveal what is really happening behind the scenes, subscribe to the channel. Because this story is getting bigger every single race weekend. At first, Miami looked like another normal Formula One weekend. Fast cars. Big crowds. Celebrities everywhere. The FIA even arrived believing they had already started fixing the problems that were destroying the opening races of the season. But underneath all of that, the atmosphere inside the paddock was completely different. Drivers were angry. Not normal frustration after a bad race weekend. Real anger. The kind that builds quietly for weeks before everything finally explodes in public. And Miami became the breaking point. Because this was not just about one controversial decision anymore. It was about a growing feeling that Formula One drivers were losing control of the cars themselves. That sounds impossible in modern Formula One. But listen to what actually started happening under the new regulations. The cars now depend heavily on complex energy systems that constantly decide when power is delivered, when energy is recovered, and when the battery suddenly drains. Drivers describe moments where the car feels stable 1 second, then completely different the next. Imagine driving on ice patches that randomly appear and disappear at 300 km/h. That is the fear spreading through the grid right now. And the terrifying part is that fans cannot always see it on television. From the outside, a driver simply looks wide in a corner. Maybe they cut a chicane. Maybe they miss an apex by half a meter. But inside the cockpit, drivers say the car behavior can suddenly change because the power systems react differently corner by corner. And this is where Miami became explosive. Because while the FIA was introducing emergency fixes behind the scenes, the stewards were also handing out penalties as if everything was fully under control. That contradiction pushed drivers over the edge. The biggest example was Charles Leclerc. Late in the race, Leclerc repeatedly went off track while defending position. The FIA concluded he gained an unfair advantage and gave him a massive 20-second post-race penalty. But here is why the situation became so controversial. Leclerc argued the Ferrari was struggling mechanically when turning right. The FIA rejected the explanation. Officially, the stewards believed the car could still make similar corners elsewhere on the circuit, meaning the move was considered avoidable. Simple enough on paper. Except drivers immediately saw the deeper problem. Because many of them already believed the new regulations were creating unpredictable handling issues in exactly those kinds of corners. Suddenly, the Leclerc case stopped looking isolated. Now it looked like proof. Proof that drivers were being punished for surviving systems they no longer fully trusted. And this is where things became deeply personal for the paddock. Because Formula One drivers can accept danger. They can accept pressure. They can even accept losing. What they struggle to accept is unpredictability. Especially when championships, careers, and safety are involved. And behind closed doors, one question started spreading through the garages after Miami. If the FIA already had to change 7 major regulations after only 4 races, how bad are the problems they are not admitting publicly yet? The public tension exploded after Miami. But the real war inside Formula One actually started weeks earlier, and almost nobody realized how serious it already was. Because the first drivers who attacked the new regulations were not rookies. They were world champions. Max Verstappen fired the first shot after Australia when he described the new rules as anti-racing and compared the driving experience to Formula E. That comment hit Formula One like an earthquake. Not because Verstappen was angry. Drivers complain all the time. It was the wording. Anti-racing. For a driver like Verstappen, that is almost the worst criticism possible. Because Formula One drivers live for instinct. Braking late. Attacking corners. Feeling the limit of the car through pure aggression and confidence. But the new regulations started forcing drivers into something completely different. Energy management, battery preservation, lift and coast driving, constant calculations. Instead of attacking every lap, drivers suddenly found themselves thinking about electrical deployment, recharge cycles, and power loss zones. And that is exactly what many of them hate. Lando Norris said the racing already felt very artificial and warned the races were becoming chaotic and dangerous. Lewis Hamilton added another criticism that quietly exposed the deeper frustration spreading across the grid. He said drivers should not be managing energy instead of racing. That sentence sounds simple, but inside Formula One, it carries massive meaning. Because when elite drivers start feeling like passengers inside systems controlled by software and battery behavior, the entire identity of Formula One begins to change. And this is where the situation became genuinely dangerous. Japan. Suzuka. The moment the entire debate shifted from frustration to fear. Oliver Behrman crashed at over 300 km per hour after a severe power loss linked to the new systems. Suddenly, this was no longer about whether the racing looked entertaining. Now drivers were questioning whether the regulations themselves were creating unpredictable safety risks. And according to reports, the reaction inside the paddock was immediate. Drivers reportedly signed a joint statement demanding urgent changes after the crash. Think about how extreme that is. Formula One drivers almost never unite publicly. Some are fighting for championships. Others are fighting to keep their careers alive. Some support the FIA. Others constantly criticize it. But after Japan, the grid reportedly came together for one reason: fear that the sport was moving too fast into systems nobody fully understood anymore. And here is where the FIA faced an impossible problem. Because the organization could not simply admit the regulations were failing. Too much money was already invested. Manufacturers built entire engine projects around these rules years in advance. Political agreements had already been finalized. So instead, the FIA started introducing emergency modifications race by race. Miami became the biggest example. The governing body reduced energy deployment differences between cars. They introduced new warning lights to alert drivers when a car suddenly slows down. They even created systems to detect dangerously weak race starts automatically. And when you step back for a second, that becomes almost surreal. Formula One cars now need warning systems because drivers behind cannot predict when another car might suddenly lose power unexpectedly. That is not a small adjustment. That is a sport trying to stabilize itself in real time. But here is the problem. The drivers believe the FIA is reacting instead of leading. And that belief is poisoning trust across the entire paddock. Because every new emergency fix raises another uncomfortable question. If the regulations were truly ready, why are they changing so dramatically after almost every race weekend? And then Miami created a second disaster the FIA probably did not expect. Because the penalties themselves became part of the rebellion. Not just the regulations. Not just the cars. The punishments. At first, the FIA believed strict penalties would help control the chaos. More track limit enforcement. Faster investigations. Stronger punishments for repeated violations. But drivers immediately saw a contradiction. The FIA was admitting the regulations needed emergency fixes, while simultaneously punishing drivers as if the system was already stable. And nowhere was that contradiction more obvious than the Leclerc penalty. The stewards argued that Leclerc repeatedly left the track and gained a lasting advantage, which triggered the harsher drive-through equivalent penalty after the race. But drivers focused on a completely different part of the story. The timing. Leclerc crossed the finish line in 6th place. Celebrated the result. Spoke to media. Finished the entire race weekend emotionally believing the fight was over. Then hours later, the FIA dropped the punishment and erased 2 positions from his result. That detail matters more than people realize. Because Formula One drivers already operate under enormous psychological pressure. Every lap is instinct. Every defensive move happens in fractions of a second. Now add another layer. Drivers no longer know whether a battle is truly finished even after the checkered flag. And this is where the frustration exploded. Many drivers believe post-race penalties solve nothing. They argue that if an incident is dangerous enough to deserve punishment, it should be handled during the race itself. Not hours later after emotions, celebrations, and championship calculations already changed. But the deeper issue is even more controversial. Consistency. Or what drivers believe is the lack of it. The Alex Albon situation during sprint qualifying became the perfect example. Albon was investigated after briefly impeding Norris, but McLaren's response influenced how aggressively the case moved forward. And that created immediate anger inside the paddock. Because drivers started asking a dangerous question. Are penalties now being shaped by politics and team reactions instead of fixed standards? That question destroys trust very quickly, especially in Formula One, where every tenth of a second matters and careers can change over one steward decision. And the timing could not have been worse for the FIA. Because while drivers were already questioning steward consistency, they were also watching the FIA constantly modify the regulations themselves. Race after race, week after week. One of the biggest emergency changes involved reducing the massive speed differences caused by electrical boost systems. Before Miami, cars could experience speed gaps approaching 50 km per hour depending on energy deployment. Imagine racing on a motorway where one car suddenly gains highway speed while another unexpectedly loses power. That is essentially what drivers were dealing with. The FIA reduced the boost levels to calm the situation down. And yes, it helped. But only partially. According to teams inside the paddock, Miami's fixes solved maybe 20% of the overall issue. That number terrified people inside Formula One. Because if emergency changes only solve 20%, then 80% of the instability still remains hidden underneath the surface. And this is where the situation becomes much larger than one controversial race weekend. Drivers are starting to feel like the sport is evolving faster than the people inside it can fully control. The FIA says the system is improving. Drivers say the core problem still exists. Teams are adapting race by race. Fans are becoming confused about penalties, energy systems, and changing rules. And meanwhile, the season keeps moving forward at full speed. Toward Canada. A circuit many inside the paddock quietly fear could expose the biggest weaknesses of the regulations all over again. Canada is where everything could finally break. Because the circuit Gilles-Villeneuve is almost designed to expose the exact weaknesses drivers have been warning about since the season began. Long straights, heavy braking zones, violent direction changes, and massive energy deployment demands on every lap. That combination is terrifying under the current regulations, especially after what happened in Japan. And the FIA knows it. That is why officials are already preparing even more aggressive energy restrictions for Montreal before the cars even arrive at the circuit. Think about what that means. Formula One is now entering race weekends already expecting the regulations to create problems. That alone tells you how serious the situation has become. But here is where the story takes another turn. Because behind all the technical chaos, another battle is quietly starting to grow. A political battle. One that could reshape the future of Formula One completely. The biggest manufacturers invested enormous money into these new engine regulations. Years of planning, research, development. Entire projects built around electrical power systems and energy management. So now the FIA is trapped between two different worlds. Drivers want simpler, more aggressive racing again. Manufacturers want the future technology they already spent fortunes developing. And those two visions are now colliding every single weekend. This is why the paddock suddenly feels divided in a way Formula One has not experienced for years. Some teams privately believe the current regulations can still be fixed with adjustments. Others reportedly believe the entire concept is fundamentally flawed. And drivers are stuck in the middle, trying to race cars they increasingly describe as unnatural. Fernando Alonso hinted at this frustration perfectly when he questioned whether fans even wanted this version of Formula One. Because underneath all the technical language, the argument is actually very simple. Fans want drivers pushing to the limit. Drivers want to attack. But the current regulations often reward management instead of aggression. Saving instead of attacking. Calculating instead of instinct. And this creates a strange feeling during races. Sometimes drivers are no longer racing each other directly. They are racing the battery. And that may be the most dangerous problem of all for Formula One. Because once fans begin feeling disconnected from the racing itself, the sport enters very dangerous territory emotionally. But here is the part most people still do not fully understand. The FIA already knows larger changes are probably coming in the future. Inside the paddock, many believe the current balance between electrical power and combustion power simply went too far. The problem is timing. Formula One cannot instantly reverse years of development overnight. So now the sport is trapped in an uncomfortable transition period where everyone knows the system is unstable, but nobody can fully escape it yet. And this creates enormous pressure heading into every new race weekend. Because another major incident could completely change the conversation overnight. Especially in Canada. A circuit where one sudden loss of power on a straight could create terrifying consequences in traffic. That fear is exactly why the FIA introduced new flashing warning systems after Miami. Again, think about how extraordinary that is. Formula One cars now need emergency visual alerts to warn other drivers that somebody ahead may suddenly slow down unexpectedly. That sounds less like a polished championship, and more like a sport trying to patch holes in real time while the season is already underway. Meanwhile, Verstappen's criticism continues hanging over the entire paddock like a shadow. Because when he described Miami's fixes as a tickle, he exposed what many drivers secretly believe. The FIA is treating structural problems like temporary inconveniences. And if Canada creates another controversy, another dangerous moment, or another confusing penalty situation, the rebellion inside the paddock may stop being quiet frustration entirely. It could become open war between the drivers and the governing body itself.